Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Will Hamas disarm? Will Israel hold back from further conflict? Who is going to fund the reconstruction of Gaza? And what kind of authority will run the region? Trump's plans for Gaza raise way more questions than they answer, but for the moment, it's the only deal in town. We're joined by our frequent guest and veteran observer of Israeli and Palestinian politics, Dahlia Scheindlin. Hello and welcome, Dahlia.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. You are actually in Philadelphia, I think on a brief academic sabbatical, and we normally speak to you in Tel Aviv, but here we are. To start with, can we just talk about the current situation in Gaza and break it down into different parts? Just to sort of, I know many people will have seen the images, which are horrendous, but if we could sort of run through the physical amount of destruction and what's left in terms of services. And while I say this, I think there's actually quite a good section on the BBC that we're going to bring up and share that runs through things like power, water, let alone sort of in institutions as well. So perhaps if Jen, who's there, can bring up, there's a website as we're talking. But overall, the destruction is enormous. We're talking about 70% of all buildings damaged, really, beyond repair, Dahlia.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to make it clear, where we stand politically, and of course, vast amounts of housing, whole cities have essentially been destroyed along with infrastructure, right? That includes primarily health infrastructure has been very, very severely incapacitated. There's been damage to all of the regular civil infrastructure of things like sewage and water. As I said, health systems. Of course, we all know how much there's been, how difficult it's been to have food distribution and aid distribution over the course of the war. I should say that at its peak, the IDF had admitted that it was holding, over 60%, as much as 65% or 70% of Gazan territory. And then since the deal that was announced at the very end of September and essentially implemented in mid-October, brokered by the Trump administration and his envoys, the agreement was that in return for the release of Israeli hostages and the release of Palestinian prisoners, that the ceasefire would include partial Israeli withdrawal alongside that release. And so the Israeli army has redeployed and now holds still about somewhere around 50 to 58%. It's a little bit hard to get actual figures that are directly controlled by the IDF right now.
We've got another slide. I don't know if we can come back to it in a second, which shows the not the destruction. There's another one. I mean, of the yellow line. Which
right. So there've been a number of maps that were released by the Trump administration's team, and they established a number of these lines. And so the yellow line is sort of the first stage of what is supposed to be a continued redeployment. Other maps that the administration have released show additional lines moving further to the east, so that the IDF is supposed to incrementally redeploy further and further to the east, presumably, or I shouldn't even say presumably, possibly up to what would be considered a kind of security perimeter close to the border, the boundary, I should say, between Gaza and sovereign Israel. Remember, none of these are final international borders. That, of course, hasn't happened yet, and it's very, very doubtful right now to what extent the plan will continue, because the fighting has been, Israel has essentially ramped up airstrikes around Gaza over the last number of days. There have been attacks on targets that Israel claims are holdouts of, Hamas, attempts to try to root out the final sort of a cell of Hamas that was barricaded into the tunnels near Rafah, and then other strikes around other parts of Gaza as well. And so the ceasefire looks like a very, very significant chance of breaking down. I can say that also with the ceasefire, the plan involved reviving coordination with the humanitarian agencies, including UN and international run agencies, which was, I would say, not to be taken for granted, considering the Americans had tried to sort of step in and take over with the Gaza humanitarian organization and the GHF, the Humanitarian Fund, which was, kind of a debacle in many ways. And, that effort over the months preceding this ceasefire ended up with a great deal of Palestinians killed trying to get to that point. So
if there's a major positive thing, food is finally flowing in. Is that fair to say?
food and other resources, so tents, supplies. Some of those supplies are intended to restart education systems, schooling. Right. I just was reading the latest report from the Office for Coordination of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, saying that more and more children now have access to about 3 hours of school per day because of the ability to bring in large-scale tents and things that can, house that kind of infrastructure. However,
I do want to jump back again. I do want to jump back and just want to
say just a second, Nick, just to say there are still blockages because the UN coordinating offices can get to the distribution points or the crossings from Israel sometimes, and sometimes, like over the last couple of days, the Israeli army has simply said, no, your access is denied because of operational reasons. So it is very erratic about when aid can get in and when it can't.
Okay, I want to come back to those. There's one PDF we've got there, which is actually from OCHA, that shows the sort of red patches, and that shows you that's again, this is from part of OCHA. It's definitely a UN satellite wing. That shows the amount of destruction. So those are buildings that are sort of completely destroyed. That's 70% of all buildings within Gaza. So let's put that slide to the side. And then if we go back to the BBC's website, there was one particularly sort of guiling thing, was if we scroll down just a bit, you can see an operation, I think it's just this September, which is dealing with Gaza's waterworks. I mean, people will have seen the videos. There's a video there that has got huge amount of destruction. I won't play that now, but if we scroll down just a bit, we can go to water and sewage, and this is in October. You can see IDF vehicles pointed out there. This is from BBC Verify. They arrive on the 7th of October, and then on the 11th of October, the area, the sections that are in that water plant have been destroyed. So that's a water treatment plant that's been destroyed after the ceasefire. And if we scroll down a bit more, you can see desalination plant that was destroyed earlier in the year. Quite how these are Hamas, centers of command and control, I don't quite understand, but there we go. And then lastly on that same website that you can see there is further down is the amount of actual productive land that has been destroyed. So that's on power, but if we go further down, we just stop there. Gaza is very well built up on the sort of western side, about 4 or 5 miles going in from the beach. But if you go further on from that, going in towards the border with Israel, it's agricultural land, and most of that agricultural land has been destroyed as well. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Dahlia. We should say that the UN obviously has passed this resolution backing some kind of international force in there. Can you just talk briefly about that, and we'll go back to what Trump's plan was before?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's plan, the one announced in late September and adopted in mid-October, is a 20-point plan that included a very bare bones vision for some sort of an international force. And there was a great question over what kind of force that would be. Would it be backed by the UN through UN Security Council resolution? Would it involve Chapter 7 provision, which means that it is able to engage militarily if needed to protect whatever its mission is? Or would it be some sort of an outside ad hoc coalition? And, all of those questions are very significant and very consequential for how this kind of force can come together. But I think the main criticism was that there was no real detail, there was no real planning, it wasn't clear which countries would be involved and under what framework and what the mandate of that force would be. So the UN Security Council resolution had been a key piece of this that was heavily debated. The US had put out its own draft, of course, in negotiation with all the relevant parties, and it went through several drafts. There were significant differences between the first draft and the final draft that passed. But in the meantime, Russia also put out a competing draft, kind of saying the UN plan is too forthcoming for the Israeli side. And so there has been debate about that. But ultimately, the UN Security Council did pass the resolution last Monday night by 13 votes to 0 opposition and 2 abstentions, the abstentions being Russia and China. So on the other hand, on the one hand, it looks like progress because it essentially endorses the Trump plan. It endorses the International Stabilization Force and tries to give a little more detail about its mandate, but still very vague and in ways that I think left, certainly many in the Palestinian community skeptical, and frankly suspicious that ultimately it's an effort to establish the US's power, because, the major layer you have to keep in mind is that the Trump plan establishes not only the International Stabilization Force, but puts together or envisions something brand new called the Board of Peace. And the Board of Peace is something that President Trump intends to run himself. And the International Stabilization Force is supposed to be answerable to the Board of Peace. So now you have a weird sort of bifurcated structure where there's a UN-backed International Stabilization Force that, again, has the grounding of the UN Security Council, but which makes it international law, right? However, it's supposed to be answerable to a Board of Peace that is effectively run by the United States. And, there is an interesting dance going on.
Does the resolution say that? Isn't it answerable to the UN, not to the Board of Peace?
Well, yes, but the Board of Peace is still supposed to be the guiding force. And so, yes, there is a mechanism in the United Nations Security Council about having to report, document and report on its actions and its updates and whether it's achieved its goals. But nevertheless, it's supposed to take direction from the Board of Peace. And this does make for a little bit of the vagueness that that is raising these kinds of fears. And the reason for that is because in the background, there is a very strong suspicion that Israel is going to find reasons. Here's, I think, the main aspect in the UN Security Council resolution that has raised grave concerns is that it does stipulate a timeline, or a vision for incremental withdrawal from the IDF. And that was an addition that was not in the original draft. So in the original draft, it didn't say anything about the IDF completing its redeployment, but the final version does. However, the final version of the Security Council resolution also says that the IDF will be consulted and, has to be taken into account in terms of measuring the milestones that would allow for that redeployment. And so, it would be very much consistent with previous agreements between Israel and, and let's say the Palestinians in the past, right? Oslo or whatever else, that Israel says, there's a conditional phased progress for this agreement, and we decide whether the conditions have been met, and guess what? The conditions have never actually been met, therefore we won't do the redeployments. It's actually exactly what happened throughout all of the 1990s, which led to the stagnation of the peace process to begin with. And so, and it's also consistent with what happened to the first hostage release deal that the Trump administration had brokered in January 2025. That was the second ceasefire deal since October 7th, but the first one brokered by the incoming Trump administration at that time. It was also a phased deal. It also collapsed. And what we're seeing right now is that it's on the brink of collapse, even a week after the UN Security Council resolution. So the fear, I think, from the Palestinian perspective, is that the UN Security Council resolution will give the backing for this international force, which will ultimately be guided by American and Israeli interests. Yet the rest of the phases that are supposed to involve transition to some sort of Palestinian transitional authority, again, not very well defined, leading towards some sort of future takeover of the Palestinian Authority, which most Palestinians resent and despise. All of that process is ill-defined. And so it could easily be that, again, the concern, look, we can talk about the opportunities, but the concern is that it becomes an American and Israeli interest in, retaining Israel's hold over, more than half the territory, maybe advancing, great real estate plans, that you mentioned by Jared Kushner, in those areas held by Israel, and that the deal essentially stops there and there's no more redeployment because Israel's military establishment never agrees that the conditions have been met. And so there's a kind of wallowing and stagnation, and that Palestinians are essentially left in in concentrated areas of deep humanitarian disaster, frankly, with maybe, nice tents to continue having 3 hours of education per day and some very ad hoc, infrastructural services that turn into something much more permanent, or what my colleagues at various stages have called, a super camp. But it's also part of a longstanding kind of very, very broad, wishful perspective on the part of the Israelis to turn the issue in Gaza into a humanitarian problem and reduce the idea that it's a political issue. And of course, it is a political question. Anybody who knows international interventions or efforts at disarmament, or, what an international force can actually achieve, whether it's a security force or a civilian intervention or both, knows that without a final status political aim, these kinds of interventions are basically bound to, for either failure at best or disaster at worst. And so there are a lot of pitfalls along the way. I have tried to propose that if the tiny opportunities in the UN Security Council to name a final status political endgame, which, again, one of those major changes between the first draft and the final draft that passed was the addition of language that says the aim is Palestinian statehood. Okay, something that was absolutely not in the first draft of the American version of this Security Council resolution. If that becomes a real focus, if the American administration really says, game over, we can't, accept, years and years more of kind of an amorphous vision of something that nobody ever defines for the future, but we are actually going to commit ourselves to Palestinian sovereignty and statehood. And, then there can be a forward motion because everybody knows where we're going, whether there are pitfalls along the way or not. And I should say that the other thing the UN Security Council resolution says is that, and the Trump plan itself, the original 20 points, is to say we respect, or we want to aim to work in coordination with previous agreements, including the French-Saudi initiative that has taken place over the last year and was adopted in a UN General Assembly resolution this past September. That's not a technicality. That process that had been led by the French and by France and Saudi Arabia led to a very robust kind of opening plan, rather detailed, about how to really rally the international community and work with Palestinian actors to advance, the true foundation of Palestinian statehood. And so I think that if there is genuine effort to coordinate plans and really work together towards something like the New York Declaration, which includes all of those very detailed plans, there can be a way forward. But the lack of trust is very deep. And of course, the Trump administration has given lots of reasons for that, right? Because there's been so much that ultimately, certainly in the first administration, just favored Israel's perspective and allowed Israel to dig in and continue expanding its occupation policies. So on the other hand, the U.S. administration is behaving rather differently this time and has in various ways shown accommodation to the demands of Arab states, particularly Qatar, Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, in trying to, move their positions a little bit closer, sometimes, pushing aside some of the Israeli preferred terms.
I mean, I suppose the obvious point is that nobody, talking about a stabilization force, without that kind of political goal or framework, nobody's ready to go and put themselves there, let alone sort of take on Hamas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of this makes the whole thing seem somewhere between, a plan full of holes with a lot of suspicion or nothing at all. Because if there's not a hard commitment from the different countries that might be involved, who's going to do it, right? America can't do it alone. And, there's been tons of speculation, tons of rumors. We hear leaks and rumors all the time about which countries might be involved, whether it's Egypt and Jordan or not, whether it's Qatar, Turkey, right? Israel doesn't want Turkey involved. But on the other hand, there's a bit of a dance between their two different evolving interests in these countries that have had a very turbulent relationship. There's talk about other Muslim countries like even Pakistan or Azerbaijan, with Azerbaijan having a kind of cooperative, even friendly relationship with Israel in recent years. But I think ultimately it's still at the level of swirling speculation and not hard commitments because they don't exactly know what their mandate is. They don't really know how long they're going to be asked to stay. The current mandate involves, the UN Security Council involved a 2-year mandate. And so, sorry, I'm just looking at messages coming in. So as a result, it's all still very much in the air because you can't just invent an international stabilization force. It has to be people have to be these forces have to be convened, trained, prepared, equipped, develop plans. Experts I've spoken to on international intervention say that can take anywhere, around 6 months. And I don't even think it's hard to say that if the process really has or hasn't gotten started yet, but I don't think we have those hard commitments or at least hard information about who's really committed to participating.
The fundamental thing is that the political dimension to this is Netanyahu and his own future. And he clearly has very little interest in a Palestinian state, and he has very little interest in seeing any kind of framework that produces any international involvement.
Yeah, I would say it goes beyond him not having an interest in it. Netanyahu is ideologically dead set against a Palestinian state. He always has been. There was a brief moment in 2009 when he gave a speech implying that he would consider in the future some kind of Palestinian state that was effectively stripped of most characteristics of statehood. But, and it may have been an opening. It may have been a real opening from the Israeli starting point or from his starting point, but it was never much more than that. And that window closed very quickly, let's say completely, by the time of the failure of the negotiation process under his government in 2013-14, which was at the end of President Obama's term. Once those negotiations were over, Netanyahu reverted completely to his position. And, I think it was also fair to argue that he didn't really want those negotiations to succeed in reaching a Palestinian state, and did an awful lot to make it, to set conditions by which they wouldn't succeed. But the point is that since then, for almost a decade before October 7th, 2023, Netanyahu, as you point out, had somewhere between little interest and active interest in preventing anything like negotiations to reach a two-state solution. And he was quite open about it. His party was quite open about it. His party, in late 2017, voted in a Central Committee meeting to establish sovereignty over the settlements and over the West Bank, what they call Judea and Samaria. And since then, his coalition partners have all been, pro-annexationists. So I think we've moved from a situation of assuming that there is an aim of getting to two states, and whether the parties are a little bit more for or against it, or have something, think about the pace or the conditions. We've moved away from that. What we've seen for the last decade, well before 2020, October 7th, is active annexationist policies. And those became extremely open in Netanyahu's own promises from about 2019 onward, when he started, releasing various plans or statements saying we're going to extend sovereignty over settlements, and we're going to annex the Jordan Valley. And then in 2020, saying we're going to annex parts of the West Bank, and then sort of putting a pause on that for the Abraham Accords, but effectively continuing policies without declaring annexation throughout that time, that advanced annexation. Of course, this is designed, it's almost like preventing a Palestinian state is sort of beside the point for the current Israeli political leadership. They don't even acknowledge that there is a Palestinian nation. It's an irritation to them. They want to consolidate Israel's de facto annexation and control over the West Bank. And since October 7th, they've expanded that vision to include Gaza. And so I would say it's even beyond Netanyahu's personal legal troubles. He is on trial for corruption. He has been actively testifying in his trial on 3 different counts of corruption. This trial has been ongoing for several years now. And that's all part of it. It's certainly the reason why he wants to keep power. And it's certainly the reason why he feels himself, deeply, deeply indebted to the few coalition partners who are willing to be in a coalition with him, and why he acquiesces, but to their very extreme fundamentalist political demands. But I think it's a mistake to assume that he's not actually aligned with them politically. He is ideologically, or he and his party. There's not really any daylight with them ideologically on these issues, and that predates the opening of his trial, and it's bigger than just his corruption cases and wanting to stay in power.
Okay, but in terms of staying in power, when would Israel used to have elections every 9 months or even less. So what's the thing that confronts him if there are elections?
Okay, well, there's 2 things going on. It's true that from 2019 onward, Israel had a very rapid cycle of 5 elections within just over 4 years. But that was unprecedented. And it's also true that Israel, as a very unstable parliamentary system, does often have short terms, and usually governments don't last a full 4-year term. However, we should also note that if there's one leader that was more capable than others of having governments that tended to last close to 4 years on a full term, that was Netanyahu, right? He was able to, because he's kind of a master of the political system, and he's also one of the most veteran, long-serving politicians in Israel at this point. He entered politics in the late 1980s, so he's been around for almost, I think he is either the longest or one of the longest serving, politicians and legislators. And so he knows the political system better than anybody else. He's been able to maneuver the parties and the coalitions like people compare him to a Svengali or a magician. And so this government is no different, right? He has managed to keep it afloat for almost 4 years, despite, truly unprecedented and extraordinary failures under his government. The elections are scheduled to be held by law around late October, possibly as late as early November 2026. That would be the regular term following the last elections in November 2020. 2022. It would take an extraordinary majority of votes within the parliament to postpone elections. It's one of the few aspects of one of the few articles in Israel's basic laws that is entrenched by a 2/3 majority that you would need to have in order to postpone elections. So it's unlikely those elections will be postponed. However, I should say that there is growing concern in the Israeli public and among Israeli political analysts that the government will try to postpone elections due to extraordinary circumstances or resurgence of war, something we're seeing a greater and greater threat of resurgence of full-out war and anticipation of that even over the last couple of days, and not only in Gaza, but also with Hezbollah and Lebanon. And so there is that concern. But let's say elections are held either as scheduled in about a year from now, or they might be held earlier, right? The government could fall pretty much, I think, if the parties within the government or Netanyahu himself decides that there's a timing reason to want to move elections a little bit earlier, so they will find the right excuse, whether it's the vote over the budget due in the spring, early spring, or whether it's the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft, which is a constant problem in Israeli society going back to the start of statehood. The fact that the ultra-Orthodox have enjoyed a blanket exemption from army service, and they have been required, the government is required by the Supreme Court to pass legislation to implement equality in terms of the draft via some sort of law that advances conscription of the ultra-Orthodox, and the government has not wanted to do that because then it would lose its coalition parties who are the ultra-Orthodox in addition to some of the others. So all of those could be reasons for early elections. But early elections at this point would simply mean that they're a few months earlier than scheduled, maybe 6 months earlier. If they haven't been called by now, and we have by a minimum of 3 months for a campaign period after elections are called, the gap between early elections and scheduled elections isn't going to be very big. And so,
listen, your projections, there was at one point, it was seen for some time that if he was going to hold an election, he was definitely going to lose, and hence his need to try and prolong the conflict and the existential. The idea of the existential threat to Israel keeps a government in power, supposedly. But what's the polling for him at the moment?
Yeah, well, the phase that you're referring to where he would definitely have lost was, in hindsight, a fairly short phase, right? At the time, it seemed to go on and on because after October 7th, his ratings plunged on every indicator. Support for his party, the perception of whether he's suitable to be prime minister, and trust in the government, and the coalition's vote in general was so low from October 7th for 6 months. Every single poll, week after week, was showing this complete failure and collapse for the government. And on the other hand, starting around April 2024, about 6 months after October 7th, the government began to see a very slow and incremental recovery in polls. And that took some time. It was so slow and incremental that, I wasn't even sure, but it finally really did go, upwards and upwards and reach basically pre-war levels of support by around the late summer, early fall of 2024. And since that time, the government's ratings have been kind of at a ceiling. They haven't gone higher than their pre-war phase, which was not great. Even before the war, this government lost popularity very quickly after the elections in 2022 due to its extremely unpopular policy of trying to undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary through a series of reforms that Israelis viewed as a complete overhaul of the judiciary and did not believe they were just a matter of reforms. And so that had created, a big social backlash, massive protests throughout 2023 to remind people. And as a result, the government was unpopular even before October 7th, meaning that in all polls, it was unable to get a majority or the same majority that it had won in the actual elections. And just to give some numbers, Israel's parliament has 120 seats, and the coalition members, the four parties who made up the coalition, had won 64 seats all combined in the elections, but in all polls during 2023, they were unable to get beyond 53 or 4 seats. And most of the polls were showing them somewhere between 52 and 53 seats. That's where they have recovered. That's the point of their recovery. That has become the ceiling. In most polls, they have been unable to really go beyond that, really ever since the summer of 2024 to the present, except for very clearly, politically biased right-wing polling, which I hesitate to trust, but I do point it out because the supporters of the government will say, oh, the mainstream media commission polls are wrong, and our polls, show that we're getting 62 or 3 seats.
Not to get too bogged down in the weeds, I guess the question for many people watching is, were he to lose the election, what's the impact on him? And then what is there going to be a coalition that emerges from that that's going to be more favorable to some kind of long-term peaceful solution? Is Israeli society really in the mood for that kind of thing? I suppose it could be, but we have to run through those steps. What does Netanyahu potentially face if he loses? And then what kind of political forces are there waiting in the wings?
Yeah, I think there's a big gap between him losing the vote, losing the actual vote and losing power. And the reason is because of the coalition building system. Even if the opposition parties get a majority, which in all polls they are getting a majority altogether, they face enormous obstacles to being able to form a coalition. And they are proclaimed obstacles because most of the right-wing Jewish political parties or Zionist political parties who are right-wing but against Netanyahu in the opposition, they have sworn that they will not go into a coalition with parties representing the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel. And without those parties, it's not very likely at this point that there will be a majority just for the Zionist parties. And so there's, first of all, this self-imposed obstacle to being able to form a coalition. Even, again, you don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but there are other obstacles as well. It's not even clear that they can form a coalition. Okay, that is an aside, because Netanyahu could still retain power even if he doesn't actually win the majority of votes. If the other side is unable to form a coalition, the president could say, well, the president gives the mandate for forming a coalition. He could give it back to Netanyahu if there is no progress on the opposition side. Yeah. If, however, the opposition is able to form a government and Netanyahu does lose power, it's going to be hamstrung by further self-imposed limits, again, because the biggest parties that will win those elections are right-wing parties, at least as a bloc. Okay, it's interesting to note that, well, no, even beyond, not just as a bloc. I mean, the second biggest party right now in Israeli politics is a right-wing party that is currently opposed to Netanyahu, and that's the party led by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who started out his political career for about a decade being to the right of Netanyahu, and was prime minister under the brief, year and a half of a change government. That's what we called it, which was kind of a rainbow of parties. So he claims he's become somewhat more moderate, right? This is a big question for any observer looking at, radical politicians, hardliners, or in the case of Syria, even former jihadis who say they've become more moderate. Nobody really knows what to believe. And I would say similarly for Naftali Bennett, he started his political life running a religious, essentially a religious hardline ultra-nationalist party, and claims he's become more moderate.
Yeah, to stand back.
What I'm trying to say is that if there is an opposition coalition, his party is currently slated to be the biggest one, and therefore it will lead that coalition, and therefore, if it follows his general ideology, even in a more moderate version, he's not a leader who is expected to support anything like a two-state solution. He has never supported a two-state solution. He has been against a Palestinian state from the beginning of his political career. That's one option. If he has become more moderate and in concert with other more centrist parties who will probably be inside a coalition, they may be more vulnerable to external pressure simply because they don't have quite.
This is the question I was going to ask: is about external pressure. To what degree is Israel or a potential Israeli government, able to succumb to international pressure? Is Trump able to apply that, or willing to apply that pressure? And the rest of the Middle East that's clearly fed up with Netanyahu, can they do so as well? I mean, it just seems to me that Israel is immune to all of this, and it's very clever at fending it all off and kicking the ball down the road.
Yeah, I mean, Trump can apply that pressure, but I think the big question about Trump is always whether he has the attention span, right? We're talking quite a long way off because, again, elections might be held in 6 months from now or a year from now, and then by the time a coalition is formed, it's another number of months. So this is a long way off. It's too hard to predict where Trump will be at this point, considering we know that he doesn't really seem to have any ideological commitment one way or the other. He wants to show victories that look good for him, victories that make him look good. It doesn't matter in a way for him what form that takes. So we don't know where he'll be in a year from now. Of course, he has the leverage. Every American president has the leverage if they're willing to use it, and Trump probably has, a bit of he has more of an armor for criticism because he is seen as so pro-Israel, and Netanyahu has such an interest in showing him as pro-Israel. And I think any other leaders in Israel, if there is an opposition, victory, will not have even the level of acumen that Netanyahu has against Trump. I mean, Netanyahu was able to run circles around President Biden, let's face it. And in terms of Trump, Netanyahu is not as impervious to Trump's pressure. He doesn't have as much impunity. Nevertheless, he still has a good rapport with him. He's still able to win concessions. And I think that the next incoming Israeli leaders won't even have that because they're simply not experienced enough. So they may be more vulnerable to outside pressure. But outside pressure, I still think has to take multilateral form. I just don't think it can be America alone. Yes, if America wants to go the full distance of saying we're going to shut off the tap of foreign aid and weapons, I mean, something very extreme, sure, that would have an enormous impact. But I can't see America ever doing that, not under Trump and not under anybody else. Although there could be a reduction, a signaling, who knows? But I still think that the best shot is for America to be coordinated and coordinate a consistent program together with Arab countries, together with European allies. And then there's really a sense of historic headwinds making it very hard for Israel to hold that off. And of course there will have to be Palestinian leadership and buy-in. We can't ignore Palestinian agency in this whole process. It can't be that the entire world is re-engineering the Middle East without Palestinian agency. That would just reinforce the dynamics that have been in place this whole time. So there are a lot of pieces that have to fall into place. I have to say it doesn't look very optimistic. And I think that the Israeli right wing is banking on that, whether it's Netanyahu or not.
Headwinds, what the historical headwinds? I didn't get that.
There's a true commitment for a coordinated policy to advance something, let's say, like the New York Declaration, that was the outcome of the French-Saudi process, that was ratified, that was adopted as a UN General Assembly resolution. If there is a genuine coordinated policy to advance that program, led by the US, together with European allies, and together with the buy-in of Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar, for example, as well as Egypt and Jordan, then I think you have such a strong kind of comprehensive global effort to do this. And if they're able to coordinate policy in ways that involve pressure, leverage, incentives, that has to include, targeting the pressure and incentive structure of both Israeli and Palestinian leadership, then I think you may have a situation where it becomes much harder for an Israeli leader to say, no, we're going to be the ones who say we're going to be the ones to just, foil this process. Now, that's big wishful thinking. I mean, I think it would take something that grandiose to move the Israeli government on this. And again, I think that we can't leave out, the importance of Palestinian leadership. It needs to be revived, reconstructed. There needs to be public buy-in at some level from, Palestinian public in the region, and ideally, of course, Palestinian diaspora communities. But all that is a tall order as well. So there are so many pieces that have to fall into place. But I think it would need to be something on that scale, on that grand scope for the Israeli government to not be able to undermine it, to prevent the Israeli government from saying no. If it was something that big, it will be much harder for Israel to say, no, we're going to isolate ourselves from all of this pressure, especially if there are, if those governments all together decide to use leverage, then it becomes much harder. Israel becomes much more constrained in trying to undermine such a process. But I realize how far off that is. And I think that, unfortunately, I have to say it's quite unlikely. I still think it's the only path forward, but I think it's unlikely that it will actually happen.
We will be speaking to Palestinians in the next 2 months on Insight here. So please do stay in touch or keep an eye on the webinars coming up. We will have people both from humanitarian organizations and Palestinians to talk about how things are for them at the moment. Truly appalling situation. But I'm very glad, Dahlia, that you see a chink to end on a discussion with a slight, if only a very slight glimpse of optimism there as well. Dahlia Scheindlin, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So we've got one more talk this month, and that's about Idi Amin. It's called Idi Amin is Back, and it's with Michaela Wrong. And it's really looking at how strongmen, if the US is pulling back, and if international institutions are pulling back, who's filling the void? And it's really in Uganda, Idi Amin is becoming popular again, which is sort of symbolic of that broader emergence of populist authoritarian leaders. So that's with Michaela Ron. She's a great speaker. That's at on Thursday at 9 p.m. this coming Thursday. We've had Lucky Forbes speaking about the Amazon tour, and we've also, you can find those recordings for those 3 talks there below. And then in terms of actual tours, we've got place coming up on the first tour next year. We've had a cancellation in Morocco, a couple of cancellations, so we've got a tour on that, otherwise full, with Richard Hamilton, formerly the BBC's Africa editor. Then with Nick Thorpe, the BBC correspondent, a month ahead of Viktor Orban going to the elections in March. So that'll be a fascinating time there. And then we're back again in Taiwan. We ran 2 tours to Taiwan in October, November. Outstanding, really, really great teams there. I mean, we've got a really good bunch of analysts. I was really impressed by it. And Taiwan is not the conflict that you think it is. The battle for Taiwan is taking place at the moment. Turkey, Ataturk to Erdogan, Ayla Jean Yakli, who writes for The Atlantic and the FT. Their places are available on that. Poland and Lithuania, the second tour, I think, is sold out. So there may be no places. If you are interested, do get in touch. We may have 1 or 2 left, but I think that second tour is almost full. There are places available on Mexico with Christy Murray, again with the FT. And we've got a second tour that's definitely confirmed. And actually that second tour is filled up, and I think we may even be doing a third tour. And if you've been watching Insight this month, you know that Lockie Forbes and Marco Ehrlich are leading that tour to the Amazon, looking at the attempts to try and prevent further erosion, particularly by criminal groups. A tough story there. That's at the end of next year, in November next year.